My name is Arnold Michaelis. I'm a subject in Refuge.
So before we dive into the film and in particular why you're part of the film and your connection to it, can you share with us a little bit about the amazing story you've had? You've been one of those names that I feel that when people are looking towards reformation, you're kind of one of the first people think of because of your story from the 90s. Can you share with us just a little bit about who Arno is?
Sure. Nowadays, Arno's a storyteller. And I tell stories in all sorts of formats. My bread and butter is speaking engagements. I've also written 2 books, and being a big fan of the phrase "fake it till you make it," I've declared myself a filmmaker, and I've told some stories via film as well. The stories I tell are really intended to inspire people to see themselves in others and see others in themselves. And it's really informed and driven by my past as a white nationalist from 1987 to 1994.
You don't have to get into details about what happened in Wisconsin in 2012, but I would really love for you to share about the people you met through what happened, creating that second book with one of them in particular, and
Right.
if you can share that friendship, it's one of the more uplifting things I've seen anyone ever come through, is what you and Pradeep have done over these last few years.
Awesome. Thanks, Scotty. I went public with my story on the MLK holiday of 2010. And by August 5th, 2012, I had built a bit of a platform for myself as a speaker and a storyteller, former white nationalist. On August 5th of 2012, a guy from the gang that I helped to start murdered 7 people in the Sikh temple at Oak Creek, Wisconsin. A couple months after that, Pardeep Singh Kalika reached out to me. Pardeep's father, Satwant, was the last person killed that day, and Pardeep needed to know how could someone do such a horrible thing and what we can do about it as a society. So Pardeep and I sat down and had dinner, and we talked for 4 hours straight, and I did my best to answer the questions he had, and we did spend a little of that time talking about Wade Michael Page, the suffering, miserable human being that had committed that atrocity. But most of the time we spent talking about our daughters and our fathers. And it really struck us that here were 2 boys who grew up on opposite sides of the planet Earth. Me growing up in the Midwest of the United States, Pardeep growing up in Punjab, India. And we were brought together by this horrific hate crime. And once we sat down to talk, we saw we had far more in common than we could have possibly imagined. And it really hit us at that point that we needed to share our stories and combine them and bring it to the world and really help people to understand that all human beings have much more in common than different. And if we can connect on those commonalities and build a foundation of our common humanity, then our differences become assets that we can celebrate and we can use to problem solve. And I really believe that once that's done, there's no problems that human beings can't solve. And Pardeep and I are still going strong. It's been 10 years now. Our anniversary actually is October 22nd. And he better remember it, I'm telling you. He forgot last year. I had to remind him. But we've been blessed. We've written a book together called The Gift of Our Wounds with a brilliant co-author, Robin Gabby Fisher. We have traveled all over the United States and the world to a degree, sharing our story of forgiveness after a hate crime and how powerful that is and how essential it is for the healing process.
Obviously, now kind of connecting it to this film Refuge, in that story there's a very similar interaction that is created by 2 people who, like you said, completely different parts of the world. When did you first hear about Chris and all this story? Like, how did you first get contacted for this thing?
since I went public with my story in 2010, it's always been a kind of a conflicting thing for me. I have zero desire to be like a public figure, or I kind of say I'm like an F-list celebrity, but it's kind of a necessary evil, because anytime my story gets coverage and in whatever sort of platform, it makes the point that people can change for the better, and that redemption is possible. And probably most importantly, it reaches those who need that message the most. People who are actively involved in hate groups, people who are suffering and feeling like they're stuck and they can't change. And so, since the day I went public, I've had a steady stream of people who would reach out to me and say, like, hey man, I'm in this group and I want to get out. I just don't know how. I'm afraid to. It's a huge change for someone's life, and it can be really intimidating when you don't have anyone to help guide you through it. So in early 2016, Chris Buckley's wife, Melissa, reached out to me and asked if I could help Chris get out of the Ku Klux Klan. And I was honored to have some resources to be able to travel to Georgia and meet Chris. The story of the work we've done together is a huge story into itself. It's kind of like the backstory of Refuge, but it took a long time to get Chris to the point where he was ready to speak with a Muslim. And as to most people, they're like, well, why would it be so hard to speak to a Muslim? Well, for Chris, his most bitter, deep-seated hatred was for Islam. And it was rooted in the trauma he endured as a U.S. Army engineer on 3 deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had horrible things happen to him there. He's done horrible things. And Chris had a really horrifying childhood full of trauma that led him to join the military in hopes that he would die in combat and then people would think he was worth something. The first friend he ever made in his life was in boot camp. And he spent his 13 years of deployment with that friend. And then on their last tour in Afghanistan, he literally saw his friend get his brains blown out right next to him. And all Chris could do was just be like, this is, Muslims did this to my friend. And when he came back home, he was injured in a Humvee accident. He had a broken back. They gave him painkillers. Of course, when he healed and he still wanted the painkillers, he couldn't get them anymore. It led him to crystal methamphetamine addiction. That's when he joined the Ku Klux Klan. That's when he really became this vile, hateful, dangerous person that a bystander would see in a Klan robe. But you have to understand that backstory that drove him there. And not understand it to say, well, that's okay, because it's never okay to hurt people. It's never okay to hate people. But if we don't understand what produced that hate, what brought him to that point, we're going to have a very difficult time diffusing it. We're going to have an impossible time in healing it. Because in order to heal it, we need to talk about all of that trauma in Chris's life, which him and I have done over the years. But it was kind of crazy, because it was actually pretty easy to get him to formally quit the Klan. That happened within a month of meeting him. He threw his Klan robe in a fire and burned it. And side note, his Imperial Wizard, the leader of this very infamous, storied Klan cell in northern Georgia that he was a part of, followed him right out. Burned his Klan robe as well. So Chris's bravery led to the dissolution of this almost 100-year-old Klan group in northern Georgia. But once he got out, it was funny also, because he's like, well, I'll spare you the actual language he used, but he said something to the effect of like, well, I'm cool with the blacks and the Mexicans now, but I'll never be cool with Iraqi Muslims. And you better understand that, and you better respect it. And at one point, actually, he pulled a gun on me at his house for suggesting that he talked to a Muslim person. And while all this was happening, I was doing my normal work, and part of that was a conference on Islamophobia at the Carter Center. And at that conference, I met a man named Haval Kelly. Haval is a Kurdish Muslim refugee. Grew up in Syria, had a very normal middle-class childhood. His dad was an attorney. He was very successful. And then when he was 11 years old, the secret police kicked down his door. They beat him up, beat up his mom, take his dad, throw him in prison, torture him for months. His dad had to spend half of his net worth to get out of prison, and then he had to spend the other half to get out of Syria. So they ended up in Germany in a refugee camp with nothing. And they lived there for years, not really seeing any hope there. They were finally resettled in the United States thanks to a group of like a conservative Southern Christian activist group that brought his family to the suburb of Clarkston in Atlanta, helped him learn how to speak English. But then from there, Haval, being 18 years old, supporting his entire family, because his dad had a nervous breakdown from the whole experience, Haval went from washing dishes in a restaurant on the Emory Medical School campus to becoming a cardiologist. And very successful. And at this conference, Haval shared his story. And you could just, it was palpable to see how much this man loved the United States of America. And I always say since then, I've never met anyone who loves this country like someone who came here fleeing for their life and found refuge. And so all this happening together, and the kicker was this. So Haval's one of these people where it's actually kind of intimidating to know him, because you're just like, I can't keep up. A lot of people are like, oh, Arnold, wow, it's so amazing you do this, and this. I'm like, you want to see amazing, meet Haval Kelly, okay? Because when I met Haval, he was finishing up his residency in cardiology, working as a cardiologist, saving people's lives. When he wasn't doing that, and if anybody knows a doctor, like, you work 6 days a week and you're on call whenever you're not working. So it's very arduous, difficult work. When he wasn't doing that, he was doing pro bono health care for people who didn't have health insurance. He had founded a nonprofit to mentor refugee and inner city kids into medicine. And he was starting a family. And when he wasn't doing all that, this was the summer of 2016 during the presidential campaign, when then candidate Trump was proposing that we have a registry of Muslim people in our country, and saying, like, we have to figure out what's going on with them and things like that. So Haval saw that as a call to action. And when in between raindrops, Haval would drive into rural Georgia, and he would look for someone with a MAGA hat. And he would go up to them and introduce himself and be like, hey, can I tell you how much I love this country? And they'd be like, yeah, tell me. And he would tell his story. And by the time he's done, like, they got tears in their eyes. And he's like, and by the way, I'm a refugee and I'm Muslim. And they're kind of like, and, I doubt he changed anyone's vote on the spot, but I know he changed hearts and minds just with that kind of connection. So as Haval's telling me that he's doing this, I had literally just come from working with Chris. And I'm like, have I got a guy for you to talk to, bro? So I connected Chris and Haval. I had finally gotten Chris to the point where he understood that there's so many parallels between addiction to methamphetamine and addiction to hate. And in the same vein, I'm an alcoholic myself. I quit drinking 19 years ago, but I'm very familiar with addiction from that standpoint. And there were times during my drinking days when I said, as every single alcoholic on this planet has said at one time after a particularly rough night, oh, no more no more liquor for me, just beer from now on. Like, and that's what I told Chris. I'm like, okay, so you're saying you don't hate black people and Mexican people anymore, but you'll always hate Muslims. I'm like, dude, you either drink or you don't. You either do meth or you don't do it. You either hate or you don't. You don't get to like pick and cherry pick and keep some little, important hatred, and then because you're never going to be able to let go of the rest of it. And after many months of working with him, I got him to the point where he was ready to communicate with Haval. And the way the film happened is Din Blankenship and Aaron Bernhardt, the brilliant filmmakers behind it, were both University of Virginia alumni, as was our EP, Katie Couric. And after Charlottesville, the three of them kind of got together, and they were stunned at the Unite the Right rally in 2017 that had happened. And they were like, we need to make a film that's the opposite of this, that shows like what's the opposite of this horrific display of hatred we just saw. And they thought of the neighborhood of Clarkston in Atlanta. They're like, here's a neighborhood where the most refugees are resettled in the state of Georgia. You have every ethnicity of human being on the planet living in this 1 square mile, every religion on the planet like actively being practiced in this 1 square mile. And not only do people get along together, they thrive together. And so originally their documentary vision was just to like, let's tell the story of Clarkston and the people who are there. And as they were doing that, that's how they connected with Haval. So they're like, well, let's tell Haval's story. As this is happening, Haval and I meet, Haval and Chris meet, and Haval says to Din and Aaron, you guys got to meet this Chris guy that I just met. And so they needed some convincing too, because they're like, well, we don't want this to be about white supremacists. Like, this is about the opposite. And Haval's like, no, trust me, you need to meet him and you need to hear this story. And that's how the focus of Refuge shifted to the finished product that I'm really excited to screen here tomorrow.
On a bigger picture, knowing that you are connected with so many people who do want to reform, are you finding it more difficult in today's world than maybe even the past? Because I feel like the notion of hate in these hate groups is not gone away. In fact, it's done the opposite.
Right.
I feel like at the height of what you were a part of in the 90s pales in comparison to where we are now in a world of hate. How are you going to keep doing this?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is not a popular one. It's one that's cost me work before, actually. But my take on this, from my lived experience, 7 years as a neo-Nazi, 12 years now as an activist trying to build peace and social fabric and community, is that today, the easy answer, of course, is social media and the internet. I was active pre-internet. I literally had to go face to face with people and spread my hate and propaganda. Nowadays, it happens at a viral scale. It's geographically independent, so someone in Norway can be cultivating hate in the United States and vice versa. But I really feel that this point in our human society right now, the biggest issue is the hyper focus on race. I think it's tragic that there are so many people who have convinced themselves that they're anti-racist while being very vehemently pro-race. And from my personal experience, and also I love to read, I love to learn, and everything I have to say is things that I've learned from listening to people, and I've listened to a lot of people that don't look like me. So this isn't like my privilege or me being in the white Midwestern bubble speaking. This is me listening and reading and experiencing to come to the point where I believe race and I could be proven wrong, but historically, race was concocted by racists in order to perpetrate racism. It wasn't like race was this neutral, objective fact of life that's been around forever, and then racists came along and exploited it. Racists created race. Race has only been a cancer to human society for about 400 years, and we've been around for about 200,000 years. So it's just in the very, very recent past that race has been a thing in our society. And what the issue is that nowadays, so many people, from the highest levels of government to the highest levels of media and education and even business, they seem to think that by branding everyone with a racial identity and then making them feel either oppressed or as they're an oppressor because of it is some kind of answer to racism. That is gold to white nationalists. As far as white nationalists are concerned, this hyper-focus on race that we have in our society today is the best thing to happen to racism since Jim Crow. And so when the Good Morning America or the Oscars or some big, Fortune 500 company are going like, well, you're white and well, you're black and oh, you're brown, and they're looking at people through that lens, it's highly conducive to the white nationalist ideology, and it's also highly conducive to every violent extremist ideology out there. It serves religious extremists, political extremists. So tribalism is something that human beings are kind of, it's a natural flaw, I think, in who we are. It's something we have a very easy tendency to revert to it, and I think it's something that needs to be overcome rather than cultivated. And when we cultivate race, no matter how, in what erudite way we try to do that, no matter what our intention is, no matter how many PhDs you have about it, the sad fact is we're cultivating tribalism. So what I believe we need to do, as I was talking about when I was talking about Pardeep and I, is see our commonalities. And at the same time, we have to bear witness to the suffering that race has caused for 400 years, because our society has not done that. And I think that's kind of the impetus towards people putting race front and center. But I'd like to see it done with an end point of saying, hey, I know post-racial is a very dirty word, but I want to live in a post-racial society someday. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, but I want it to happen in my daughter's lifetime. I want there to be a society where it doesn't mean a damn thing what color your skin is. Like, that's the society that I want to bring about, and that's the society where white nationalism can't function.
Oh, no, I don't think anyone could say it more perfectly. Thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you for having that platform. Love to give you a chance just to give us how can people find more about you, sites, people where they can reach out and help this cause.
Sure. I neglected to mention a brilliant organization called Parents for Peace. When we watch Refuge Tomorrow, the very last frame has a still where it says, if you or a loved one needs help getting out of a hate group, please contact Parents for Peace. Parents for Peace can be found at parentsforpeace.org with the number 4. We have a toll-free nationwide helpline that's available 24 hours a day. It's 1-844-49-PEACE. People can call that line and get help if they're concerned about a loved one getting involved in violent extremism of any sort. And individuals can call that hotline and get help themselves. We have a great triage staff that takes each call and directs those people to get the help that they need. We have brilliant mental health professionals on staff, the lead of whom is Pardeep Singh Kalika, who strangely developed an interest in mental health after him and I met. I don't know what that's about.